Okay, let's dive right in. We're looking at something pretty staggering today, this news from November 1st, 2025. I mean, it felt like it redefined what maximalist foreign policy could even mean.
It really did. You had a sitting U.S. president issuing this, well, incredibly aggressive threat, direct military intervention against Nigeria.
And Nigeria is supposed to be a key strategic partner. That's what makes it so jarring.
Exactly. And the threat wasn't, vague diplomatic speak. It was specific. Airstrikes, maybe even troops on the ground.
Wow.
Yeah. And the way it was delivered, the speed, the platform, it was all part of the shock value, I think.
Right. And the official reason given, the justification from the administration, was laser focused. President Trump explicitly said it was because of the alleged mass slaughter of Christians in Nigeria by Islamic terrorists.
And that threat landed almost immediately after Nigeria was officially designated a country of particular concern, a CPC for religious freedom violations. The timing is key there.
Okay, so there are layers here. What's our mission for this deep dive? We're digging into the sources to try and figure out, well, what was this? Was it a real military plan they were ready to launch?
Or was it, just political theater?
Yeah.
Purely for the audience back home? Or maybe something else entirely, like a really high-stakes geopolitical pressure play?
Our sources seem to lean towards a mix, a pretty complex blend. But let's hold off on the final verdict for now. First, we really need to get into the sheer audacity of how this whole threat was made.
Okay, so the delivery itself. It was like a personalized directive. It completely sidestepped the usual channels, State Department, Pentagon protocols.
That alone sends a message, doesn't it? It tells you who's really driving the bus on this one.
Absolutely. So the directive hits on the president's Truth social platform, a social media post demanding the Nigerian government move fast or else face consequences.
Not exactly a formal diplomatic note, then. It's basically an ultimatum blasted out on social media for everyone, including the Nigerian president, to see.
And the language. It was clearly chosen to shock, to compel. We should probably use the actual quote. It's quite something.
Yeah, let's hear it.
If we attack, it will be fast, vicious, and sweet, just like the terrorist thugs attack our cherished Christians. I mean, that's not language for negotiation.
No, that sounds like pure intimidation, signaling absolute readiness to use force.
And it wasn't just words on social media. You also had this symbolic move, changing the Department of Defense back to the Department of War.
Good Department of War, yeah. That name change itself is a huge piece of framing, isn't it? Suggests a shift away from deterrence towards, well, kinetic action.
Definitely. And right after that name change, the president directly instructs this new Department of War to prepare for possible action, specifically telling them to come up with options for deploying troops or conducting airstrikes.
So even if it wasn't maybe logistically feasible right then, it put the entire military establishment on notice publicly.
And it wasn't just an internal memo either. The Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, he jumps onto X social media and doubles down. He says the Department of War is preparing for action.
And he laid out that stark choice for Nigeria, right?
Yeah, basically. Either the Nigerian government protects Christians, or we will kill the Islamic terrorists who are committing these horrible atrocities. Just incredibly blunt. Zero ambiguity about publicizing the threat.
Okay, so connecting this back to the CPC designation you mentioned earlier, that happened right before the military threat.
Immediately before. And that's where the choice of policy tools gets really interesting. CPC, Country of Particular Concern, it comes from the International Religious Freedom Act, IRFA, from back in 1998.
And IRFA usually means things like sanctions, maybe some diplomatic penalties, sort of soft power tools, generally speaking.
That's exactly right. It's designed for leverage, maybe travel bans, cutting some aid, things like that. It's not normally a green light for military action.
So linking the CPC designation directly, immediately, to a threat of airstrikes or troops, that's the unprecedented part.
Completely unprecedented. It's a massive expansion of what the CPC designation is supposed to mean. Analysts basically called it the weaponization of religious freedom advocacy. Taking this diplomatic tool and turning it into, like, a trigger for military threats.
Okay, so the language was extreme. The policy link was novel, let's say. You'd think the justification must have been rock solid, right? The administration was pushing this narrative of Christian mass murder, that Christianity faced an existential threat in Nigeria. What did the sources actually say about that?
Well, the sources waved some pretty big red flags. While that narrative was pushed really hard, by certain political figures too.
Senator Ted Cruz was mentioned as supporting some of those claims.
Right. But the Associated Press actually looked into it and found that some of the key data being used, some of the most extreme claims, were based on unfounded claims and even old reports.
That's significant. So the U.S. narrative was heavily based on this very simple, almost one-sided story. Christians are victims of genocide by terrorists.
Yes. And Nigerian officials, understandably, pushed back hard. President Bola Ahmed Tinubu specifically said, look, religious freedom is in our constitution. And he pointed out Nigeria is about half Christian, half Muslim. Maintaining that balance is, critical for them.
We need to give the objective picture here. The sources are pretty clear that the security crisis in Nigeria is way more complex than that simple narrative suggests.
It really is. The violence, unfortunately, hits people of all faiths. A lot of it seems driven by location, by fights over resources, not purely by religious identity.
So it's not just terrorists versus Christians.
Not at all. Objective analysis shows it's multifaceted. I mean, yes, you have groups like Boko Haram and ISWAP, and they do target Christians.
Yeah.
But they also target Muslims. Any Muslim they see as insufficiently devout by their extremist standards is a target too.
So Muslims are victims in the north as well.
Absolutely. Many victims in the predominantly Muslim north are Muslims. And then you have these widespread communal conflicts. Many experts think these are actually the main driver of the large-scale violence.
Often related to climate change. Land disputes.
Exactly. Disputes over land, water, grazing rights, often exacerbated by climate change pressures. The data we looked at really bears this out.
Yeah, there was that specific data, 2019 to 2023. It showed Fulani herdsmen, who were mostly Sunni Muslims, were responsible for, tragically, over 9,000 Christian civilian deaths.
A terrible number. But crucially, that same data for the same period shows those same conflicts led to the deaths of almost 1,500 Muslim civilians as well.
So the data itself proves it's not a purely sectarian conflict. It cuts across both communities, driven by these other factors.
Precisely. The violence is horrific, no question.
Yeah.
But hammering on this simplistic Christian genocide narrative, it's actually dangerous. It risks validating a one-sided view that could just pour fuel on the fire, make those internal divisions in Nigeria even worse.
And undermine the Nigerian government trying to manage a really complex security situation in a country with that 50-50 religious split.
Exactly. It makes their job harder, potentially much harder.
Okay, so if the justification was, let's say, incomplete, and the threat itself was so over the top, it brings us back to that core question. What was the real goal here? If it probably wasn't operationally doable, and we'll get to why in a sec, what were they actually trying to achieve?
Well, the consensus among analysts seems pretty strong. This was mainly about domestic politics. The rhetoric was aimed at domestic audiences.
Makes sense, that aggressive style, the Department of War thing, the sort of shoot first, ask questions later vibe.
It fits perfectly with what political scientists sometimes call the Jacksonian foreign policy tradition.
Right, named after Andrew Jackson. Kind of prioritizing national honor, decisive force, maybe less concerned with international norms or, you know, drawn-out diplomacy.
And the idea, and crucially, the promise to protect persecuted Christians overseas. That is a huge central issue for the U.S. evangelical conservative base, a really powerful motivator.
So this whole intervention, rhetorically speaking, it was like a massive signal flare to that base, a rallying cry.
You could definitely see it as significant political theater, yeah. Designed to energize supporters, maybe thinking ahead to the next election.
Okay, so that covers the domestic angle. But you mentioned something earlier that sounded, frankly, more cynical. This idea of strategic leverage on totally unrelated issues. What was that term again?
Punitive linkage diplomacy. And this is where I think you see the deeper strategy.
Okay, explain that.
The core idea is that this military threat, this ultimatum about Christian safety, seems directly linked to other U.S. goals that have nothing to do with religion or terrorism in Nigeria. It's using the threat in one area to force Nigeria's hand in others.
Like what? What were the other areas?
Well, first, economics. Nigeria is Africa's biggest oil producer, huge reserves. So the pressure could be a way to, ensure stable supplies, maybe get better terms, especially with China becoming more influential in the region. Resource security is always a factor.
Okay, oil makes sense. What else?
Migration. This was happening right when Nigeria was digging its heels in, refusing to take back migrants deported from the U.S.
Ah, unlike some other African countries that had agreed.
Exactly. Several others had complied, but Nigeria was holding firm. So you see the timing.
Wow. So connecting those dots, you use this massive, potentially terrifying military threat, even if you can't actually carry it out.
Yeah. and you time it with demands about oil access and migrant returns,
Yeah.
it basically forces Nigeria to the table on those other issues, doesn't it? It raises the stakes dramatically.
That's quite a tactic. Did the Nigerians see it that way?
It seems like they did.
Yeah.
Spokespeople didn't just react to the military threat literally. They almost immediately framed it publicly as a possible negotiating tactic.
So they called it out as theater, aimed at getting concessions elsewhere.
Pretty much. They seemed to understand it wasn't just about the stated reasons, but about applying maximum pressure across the board. They recognized the linkage.
All right, now let's circle back to why this was likely theater, why it wasn't really an executable military plan. You mentioned legal and logistical brick walls. Let's start with the law, international law. What stops the U.S.?
Well, it's pretty fundamental. UN Charter, Article 2, Paragraph 4. It strictly prohibits the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state.
Okay, so unilateral military action is basically illegal unless...
Unless you have very specific exceptions.
Yeah.
UN Security Council authorization, which wasn't going to happen here, or clear self-defense against an armed attack also didn't apply, or the explicit consent of the country involved.
And Nigeria clearly did not consent. They rejected the threat.
Firmly rejected it. So any unilateral U.S. strike or deployment would have been a straightforward illegal act of aggression under international law. Full stop.
Okay, international law says no. What about U.S. domestic law? Doesn't the president have limits?
Absolutely. The big one here is the War Powers Resolution of 1973.
The post-Vietnam check on presidential power to wage war.
Exactly. It requires the president to get congressional approval, usually through something called an authorization for use of military force, an AUMF for any military operations lasting more than 60 to 90 days.
And could the president claim some kind of emergency power to bypass Congress, like an imminent threat?
That's the usual argument, but it just doesn't fit here. The security situation in Nigeria, however serious, wasn't an imminent threat to the United States itself. It clearly didn't meet the threshold needed to legally bypass Congress under the War Powers Resolution.
So international law says no, U.S. law says no without Congress. Then there's just the practical reality. Could they even do it? The strikes, the troop deployment.
And this is maybe the most concrete barrier. Logistically, it faced huge challenges. And the main reason for that comes down to one big recent change in the region.
What was that?
The U.S. withdrawal from its main counterterrorism base in Niger just last year.
Right. They pulled out of Niger. How big of an impact did losing that base have?
Massive. That base was crucial for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance ISR across the entire Sahel region, including northern Nigeria.
So the eyes and ears in the sky, basically.
Pretty much. Drones, surveillance flights, intelligence gathering. Losing that Niger base severely handicapped the U.S. ability to track these dispersed, mobile terrorist groups operating across Nigeria's enormous territory.
It's like trying to find needles in a giant haystack, but someone took away your map and your binoculars.
That's a good analogy. You simply can't effectively target or deploy against groups you can't properly track, not without immense risk and questionable effectiveness.
So you put it all together, international law, domestic law, and the sheer lack of the necessary military footprint and intel.
And the conclusion becomes pretty clear. This directive, despite the fiery language, was primarily a political performance. It wasn't a realistically executable military order at that moment.
Okay, so even if it was theater, even if it wasn't a viable threat, surely an episode like this has consequences for the relationship between the U.S. and Nigeria. How did Nigeria handle it?
They handled it quite skillfully, actually. The sources describe their reaction as firm but measured. On one hand, they strongly asserted their sovereignty, rejected that whole Christian genocide narrative flat out.
Stood their ground.
Definitely. But importantly, they didn't slam the door shut. They kept saying they were willing to talk, to engage in dialogue, to clear up any misunderstandings about the security situation.
Smart diplomacy. Defend your position, but leave room for de-escalation. But what about that threat that came with it? The threat to cut off all aid. That must have stung.
Oh, absolutely. That's a serious risk. Because U.S. aid to Nigeria isn't trivial. It includes significant support for maritime security, military training, the IMED program, and joint counterterrorism efforts, things that actually help Nigeria fight the very groups the U.S. was talking about.
So threatening to cut that aid could actually undermine the shared security goals.
Precisely. It risked damaging the trust needed for that cooperation. And by challenging Nigeria's sovereignty so publicly, so aggressively, you risk pushing them away.
Pushing them towards who? Other partners.
Well, potentially, yeah. Countries like China or Russia, would likely be quite happy to increase their security influence if the U.S. creates a vacuum.
Which could damage long-term U.S. strategic interests across the whole Sahel region, not just in Nigeria.
That's the danger. Nigeria is a huge, influential country. Alienating them has regional ripple effects. So looking forward, effective U.S. policy probably needs to avoid this kind of escalating rhetoric, especially rhetoric that plays into sectarian narratives.
And instead focus on reinforcing the existing cooperation, respecting sovereignty.
Yeah, focus on the sustainable, cooperative security channels that already exist, while treating Nigeria as the sovereign partner it is. Hashtag tag tag outro.
Well, this has been quite the deep dive. We started with this really shocking headline, a potential U.S. military intervention in Nigeria, and we've sort of unpacked it layer by layer.
Yeah, we moved from that initial threat to seeing this complex strategy underneath, this punitive linkage diplomacy.
Where the rhetoric, the performance, actually achieved quite a lot politically at home and applied maximum pressure internationally.
Even though the actual military action wasn't really on the table because of all those legal and logistical barriers we talked about.
It seems the non-viable threat still had very high utility politically at home and as leverage abroad, forcing talks on things like migration and oil.
Which brings us to a final thought, really a question for you, the listener. Given how effective this maximalist strategy seemed to be using an impossible threat to achieve concrete political and diplomatic goals, does this signal a permanent shift? Are we seeing a move in U.S. foreign policy away from traditional measured diplomacy, even if the new approach challenges international law and strains key alliances?
Something to definitely keep an eye on as you watch how things develop on the world stage.